As it is a few minutes past our starting time, we would like to welcome everyone to the IPR webinar series sponsored by the University of Florida College of Journalism and Communications, one of the top 5 PR programs in the U.S. They offer undergraduate, graduate, and online master's programs. My name is Tina McCorkindale, and I'm the President and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited about the webinar. We also have a couple other webinars in our webinar series next month. On September 6th, join our Director of Research, Dr. Sarab Kochar, for a discussion on behavioral science and how it can help us better understand stakeholder decision-making and behavior. On October 11th, we will explore insights and findings from a new study with KPMG about women in leadership in the public relations profession. Now let's get to today's show. On your screen, you should see the PowerPoint presentation. Today's presentation will be available on our website for playback within the next week. We would like to welcome and introduce our co-hosts of today's webinar, Steve Cody and Linda Rutherford, two of our great trustees with the Institute for Public Relations. Linda is our chair and Steve is our vice chair of the board. First, let's talk about Linda Rutherford. Linda Rutherford is Senior Vice President, Chief Communications Officer for Southwest Airlines, where she oversees a wide range of functions, too many to list here, including media relations, crisis communications, community relations, culture services, change leadership, and employee communications. Prior to joining Southwest Airlines in 1992, she was a journalist at the Dallas Times-Herald and Newsweek magazine in New York. Steve Cody is the co-founder and CEO of Peppercomm, an award-winning strategic integrated communications and marketing agency headquartered in New York City with offices in San Francisco and London. You should really check out his blog when you get a chance. He's a great writer. Thank you both very much for being here. We're excited about this webinar, and this is a follow-up to a co-authored study we did with Peppercomm, looking at how communications and marketing leaders are increasingly taking a stand on social issues. So before I turn it over to our host, let's go over some logistics. To live tweet during the webinar, please use the hashtag IPRwebinar. You can follow Linda on Twitter at SWAfollower and Steve on Twitter at RepManCody. If you have a question, please type it in the chat box within WebEx at any time. Please make sure when you use the chat function, you send your question to the host and all panelists option. And don't forget, you can also tweet your question using the hashtag IPRwebinar. So I think we're ready to go. Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tina, and thanks in advance to Linda for doing this with me, and thanks to all of you for taking time out to join us today. I'd be hard-pressed to name a more topical subject than what is happening as we speak, societal crises, and the increasing impact it's having on CCOs, CMOs, agencies, everyone in our world. So I'm really excited about today. So moving to the presentation, we'll be going back and forth. The best practices will be coming from Linda. I'll be doing occasional play-by-play. But obviously, we're living in a new world filled with new types of crises. That's no surprise to anyone. And as Tina said, we've had the opportunity, Peppercomm, to take a deep dive qualitatively with over 50 CCOs and CMOs of major organizations to find out exactly what they're doing, how they're doing it, what they aren't doing, what they need, et cetera. So just to set the stage before we get into the research, more than 80% of consumers believe corporations should take action on important issues. Nearly half of millennials believe CEOs have a responsibility to speak up about important social issues. More than half are more likely to buy from a company led by an activist CEO, and we'll get into some examples of activist CEOs. Almost 2/3 of employees of all ages, even those as old as me, expect their employer to take a stand on major issues of the day. And no surprise, bad news travels a whole lot faster than good news, and false news is even faster than bad news. 70% more likely to be retweeted than the truth. So it's a brave new world, and your father's crisis plan really needs to be tossed out the window and updated to reflect what is happening. So moving ahead, just left to right yesterday, I think, or the day before. Maybe it was over the weekend, 1-year anniversary of Charlottesville. No need to elaborate on that. Obviously, you know, you got the Black Lives Matters, the Klan. You've got a person in the White House who seems to think both sides were at fault. No commentary or editorializing, but it is what it is. Hashtag Me Too. In terms of that's Les Moonves of CBS, in case you don't recognize him, but just about every CCO and CMO were either personally going back 15 or 20 years or working with their human resources department to make sure their C-suite and their board of directors didn't have any sort of incident like Mr. Moonves did back in the 80s. Sponsorship gaps, there have been a lot of them. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the one involving Keurig coffee makers on the lower left-hand side, but very quickly, one person sent an email to Keurig complaining that they were sponsoring the Glenn Beck show. As a response, whoever saw that email immediately yanked the sponsorship of Glenn Beck's show, not realizing that a good percentage of the customer base are office managers who tend to skew conservative and like and admire Glenn Beck. So they took turns taking videos of creative ways in which they were destroying their Keurig coffee makers, up to and including setting them on fire and tossing them off the top of their buildings. Keurig issued a response and put their sponsorship back in place. False news, I won't talk about what the New York Times has said in terms of truths, mistruths, half-truths, but the big concern, I think, for everyone on this phone is, on this call rather, is the way in which the media in particular are being positioned as public enemy number one. And obviously we are intrinsically tied to the media. So that's a very real danger, not only to our profession, but society at large. Again, I don't mean to editorialize. And then the self-inflicted wounds, obviously, and we're going to get to this, but the whole situation at the southern border and children being separated from their parents is a very, very white-hot issue, and quite a few companies have taken pro and opposite stances, and we're going to get to a couple and what the implications are in terms of what they did or did not do. There's a big leadership gap. Obviously, the divisiveness in the company, what's going on every single day in terms of indictments, in terms of personal issues with various candidates on both the Democratic and Republican side. Hard-pressed to find some individuals that resonate with the word trust anymore. Religion, I'm a Roman Catholic, so I feel I can speak out on this, but the travesty that's unfolding in the state of Pennsylvania is indicative of what is still a very, very badly broken model. And obviously that's not in any way, shape, or form, reflecting on other religions. But I don't think, people turn to the religious leaders. Certainly, I'm having a time as a Catholic buying into what's being allowed to continue to happen, and I'll leave it at that. We talked about the media. A number of surveys have shown that right next to lawyers, media are at the bottom of the list in terms of favorability and trust, and that's so unfortunate. And again, it's the reality of the situation. As we all know, in a polarized world, so many Americans get their news and information from either the far left or the far right, and that's problematic for us. So it's a huge opportunity for business, and as we indicated earlier, employees are really expecting their leaders to speak up and speak out on relevant societal issues that matter to their company, and they want to know that they joined a company whose values are in alignment with their own. So I'll take the first one on the left, and then I'll turn it over to Linda. But obviously, Rose Marcario was front and center when the EPA began rolling back, countless Obama-era rules and regulations, and she spoke up right away and said, "We will not let President Trump tear down our heritage and sell it to the highest bidder." Same thing happened, as you know, with the CEO of one of Linda's competitors, Delta Airlines, when they yanked their, whatever it was, their special rates for members of the NRA. There was a big pushback, and he said, our values are not for sale. So those are just two, examples of CEOs who are standing up, speaking out, doubling down on their higher purpose, and making it very clear to their employees, their customers, their complete supply chain, who they are and what they stand for. And then Deloitte, Linda, do you want to talk about Deloitte and the issues that they had with their contracts with ICE?
Yeah, this was an interesting one where obviously critics began to take Deloitte to task for the connection that they had in their consulting, and their very quick response was that they were going to keep those, they were obviously being asked to cut all ties with ICE based on the behaviors that were happening at the border, and they very quickly came out and said that no, we're going to maintain these contracts. They don't really have anything to do specifically with what's happening, the issue at the border, and in fact, what we're working with ICE to do is make them a better organization tomorrow than they are today. So Deloitte felt as though they were responding for the greater good. There is some debate as to whether, the CEO's voice was strong enough in sort of defending Deloitte, and in fact, they got some, as always happens today, and that's one of the tricks about helping to decide whether or not companies should get involved in certain issues, is that there's never going to be one clear-cut slam bang. You're always going to have critics and critique on either side, and in fact some of the employee base was split in terms of how they felt their own company was sort of addressing and managing some of this sort of pop-up criticism.
And then just as everyone knows, and Papa John's has been front and center in terms of the alleged use of a racial slur on a conference call. The CEO, ex-CEO, accusing his digital firm of extortion, suing his own company. 3 agencies that had been representing Papa John's resigned the account. There's a new agency on board. I wish them well. I think what we're seeing, or what we saw with Papa John's, probably is a systemic problem, because whatever's at the top usually permeates the organization. Again, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I think there have to be some internal organizational changes in terms of their purpose, their values, et cetera, before the communications can start to rebuild the trust and reputation that Papa John's has self-inflicted. And then recently, 10 days ago, it seems like 2 years ago, but our president unfortunately went after LeBron James, who was just interviewed by Don Lemon, and he said he made LeBron look smart, which isn't easy to do. I like Mike, meaning Michael Jordan. Phenomenal response from the commissioner of the NBA, who tweeted immediately, LeBron is one of the all-time greatest NBA players and one of the most accomplished athletes. He runs a very successful media company. He sent hundreds of students to college and just opened a school in Akron where at-risk students will receive free tuition, meals, and transportation. I greatly admire his intelligence and business acumen and have enormous respect and appreciation for what he does in his community. In my mind, that's a best practice. He did not in any way, shape, or form go after Trump directly, but spoke up and defended one of the icons of his sport. And the exact opposite, I would say, would be Roger Goodell of the NFL, who continues to waffle back and forth on this whole players taking a knee issue, which you can guarantee, and Trump's already been at it, and I guarantee come, opening weekend, it will be the issue of the day. So again, I hope the NFL commissioner takes his cue from what the NBA commissioner said. And just on that note, Brent Musburger, who you guys may know, longtime sports announcer, was interviewed, and he said about this whole thing, the potential danger is the insult being delivered to customers. This is a very, very tricky situation for ownership. I've talked to several, and they're beside themselves, because just when they think things are quieting down, President Trump will get on his Twitter high horse and unload again. Then, of course, The certain segments, this is speaking about football, the certain segment of the football population will respond accordingly, and the two sides harden on their sides of the particular issue. It's a business issue, and it's a social justice issue. So again, we're focusing on the business part of this as opposed to the societal, but it's huge, and it's going to continue. It's not going to get any better. Let me just make sure I'm doing this right. Bear with me here. Technology is not my strong suit. Okay. Let me just see what's going on here. Bear with me. No. Sorry about that. Oh, it skipped ahead on me. I apologize. This is typical of me. Okay, there we go. Okay. On the plus side of things, Sanofi's response to Roseanne Barr's tweet after she, said some horrible things, and she wrote, "Guys, I did something unforgivable, so do not defend me. It was 2 in the morning, and I was ambient tweeting. It was Memorial Day, too. I went too far and do not want to defend it. It was egregious, indefensible, yada, yada, yada." Sanofi, makers of Ambien, responded by saying, "People of all races, religions, and nationalities work at Sanofi every day to improve the lives of people around the world. While all pharmaceutical treatments have side effects, racism is not a known side effect of any Sanofi medication." In one fell swoop, they doubled down on their higher purpose, and they used humor as a powerful weapon to disarm the attack, if you will, of Roseanne Barr on their touchstone product. So again, I would point to this as a best practice in terms of responding in the moment to your company suddenly being called out by someone. Moving ahead. Now we're going to get specifically into the research that we conducted, as I said earlier, with 50 CCOs and CMOs. The key findings. Companies are spending more time, no surprise, addressing social topics, and many feel the pressure to respond rapidly, and Linda will address this. What is the time frame, proper time frame to respond? Do you respond? How do you respond? On what channels do you respond? There are so many variables to this. More and more companies, as we were interviewing them, were reviewing their crisis plans. Unfortunately, 2 or 3 of them still believe that the gold standard is the crisis plan that was created for them by their agency 5 or 6 years ago, and are still holding tight with that, which I think is problematic, but that's just my point of view. Again, false news, it's challenging communications and executives everywhere. You never know when someone's going to post something about any company that's diametrically wrong, and you have to decide, and maybe Linda can address this. If it's somebody with no followers, maybe you don't respond and ignore it, but if it's, from the far left or the far right, you cannot let false news go unchallenged. I don't know, Linda, if you want to speak to that at all.
Well, so we have been, speed more than anything I think has been our greatest challenge. So the first thing you have to do is have some methodology and process for how you're going to understand what is being said, what's out there, and being able to harness, the sentiment very quickly, and then decide how much oxygen you want to give it when you're trying to defend something, and knowing that it can get away from you pretty quickly. We've had certainly a few situations of that where we're always trying to figure out how we can literally move faster than we think we can, because once a topic sort of takes off in the public domain, obviously everyone sort of leads first with emotion and second with logic, and so if we begin to lose, and that can happen within hours, lose the emotional argument, it's impossible to come back in with any sort of rationalization or to be rational and fact-based and think that you're going to win over those who've already sort of made up their mind and moved on.
Yep. And so the big finding was that 2/3 of the respondents were in the process of gearing up and figuring out what they should be anticipating in terms of a Trump tweet, in terms of false news, in terms of whether or not they want to speak out about tariffs or illegal immigration or whatever. And I followed up with about 5 of them just this week, and I asked them specifically, are you ready for the midterm elections in terms of what the big issues are? And I said, for example, to one whose headquarters is in a state where there's a key midterm election, I said, suppose illegal immigration is the key issue. Will you speak out on it? And the CCO said, I haven't given it any thought. So they need to start giving it some thought. And I'm going to turn it over to someone who has, and I think the next 10 minutes are all Linda's, because this should be your takeaway in terms of what Linda has done at Southwest. So I will go to the next slide. All yours, Linda.
Thanks, Steve. I wanted to just walk through, so please understand when I am sharing this with you today, it is in the interest of just sort of being very vulnerable with you all and explaining how we have implemented a framework and a process to have some of these very difficult conversations and arrive at recommendations for our C-suite. It is a bit of trial and error. It's obviously not perfect, and so I'm not here as an expert today to tell you go do this. We've had the chance to share with some other organizations, both profit and nonprofit, and I think we'll continue to sort of iterate on this. But what we determined, and if I can kind of just walk you through our catalyst event. So back when the Defense of Marriage Act was before the Supreme Court, there was a request that companies sign on to an amicus brief, or a friend of the court brief. And so the request came into Southwest Airlines through our general counsel legal department, and it was a request to sign on to the amicus brief. The legal department at the time sort of took a look at it, obviously from a legal lens, and determined that one way or the other, however the Supreme Court might rule, the way that we would define companions and provide benefits for them really wouldn't change materially. So they determined that we didn't have a dog in that hunt, and so they opted not to sign on to the amicus brief. A few days later, some headlines started appearing, one in a national LGBT publication, and the headline was "The Case of the Missing Signature." When you read the story, we were prominently highlighted as a company that seemed like a real miss to this publication based on what they knew about our purpose, mission, vision, and values. Sort of welcoming all people on board our airplanes, being a very open and inclusive workforce. Why would we not have signed on to the amicus brief? So that prompted a call from our CEO to our office with a very simple question: why did we not sign on? And so that kind of kicked us into high gear to understand where the request had come in, how it was evaluated, and ultimately what the decision was. So that pointed to an opportunity for our company to take a much more collaborative and holistic view at social issues in general, recognizing communications can't make the decision in a vacuum, general counsel can't, our HR human resources arm can't, marketing. We really needed to be more cohesive in how we were going to look at this. And we also needed a framework, because we didn't really have, we could get a bunch of people together in a room and say, what do you think? But we didn't have a good framework for the conversation. So we spent a couple of months collectively, we came up with some guiding principles, which is every time we are asked to engage on a social topic, we wanted to use as our guiding principles speed, courage, and consistency. So speed, knowing that we have to move very quickly, which some of Steve's research obviously pointed out. Consistency, and when I say consistency, don't think you always have to engage or you always don't, but you do need to be consistent with your organization's purpose. And so when you start to flip-flop on that, people will take your credibility into question. And then courage, just really the courage of the organization to have the difficult conversation, whether or not the ultimate decision is to engage, but be willing to even have the conversation. And I'll tell you that, 4 years ago, the idea of engaging in social issues was not necessarily a popular topic to bring up, because the sort of lament or complaint was, can't we just run a good airline? I mean, is that not good enough to win customers and have communities think well of us? And so it took some internal awareness and building some leadership narrative for them to understand that, well, first of all, our purpose is a greater purpose that people have bought into, but it's about more than just flying airplanes and having on-time flights. It is about being a fabric of the communities that we serve. And so when you don't engage or you don't even look at an issue, sometimes that can be its own answer in the public domain. So we created something called a Social Topics Committee, and that has cross-functional representation from governmental affairs, regulatory compliance, communications, diversity and inclusion, people department, and investor relations as a publicly traded company. We have a standing monthly meeting, but we also have a commitment to engage. If a sudden issue comes up, we can send out an alert, we can all jump on a phone call, and we can work through the framework that we've set up to sort of look at whatever X issue or X opportunity is. And so about a year ago, this has really come into full fruition. And so what we see on the slide are our guiding principles, which I explained, of speed, courage, and consistency. Our guidelines to activate, we've already said any member of the committee can activate the team for a necessary discussion. The committee member who activates the team is responsible for creating the call that we can all get on. And then, you know, if you're just not quite sure if you want to pull the trigger, anyone can really email the team and just sort of raise the question and say, do we need to have a large, quick conversation? And then our commitment is that we would activate and engage within 12 hours. So when I say engage, that is come to a decision, and we can either, you know, depending, we have sort of an escalation process, whether we can make the decision to engage and what that looks like, or if we have to make it a recommendation up to the CEO's office. We've sort of got some guidelines for how we will respond there. And then among the things to consider is just sort of an awareness. I mentioned this earlier. You're never anymore going to engage, if you choose to, on an issue and think that everyone's with you. So there are going to be critics on both sides of an issue and supporters on both sides. So you have to understand that. You know, there's an understanding that needs to be in the organization that you're now entering that sort of social discourse. So you're going to see both emotion and rationalization. You also need to understand that there is some cost, right, in getting involved and engaging, and some of that is what you see below in our little triangle here, is that we want to assess the impact to the business of engaging or not engaging. We want to be sure we have a good understanding of what our impact to employees might be, or the perception of our employees if we do or don't engage. What might the customer reaction look like on both sides? What might the general public's perception be? Is there going to be any impact to government relationships we have? And that's really at any level, so local, state, obviously federal. Where is the pressure coming from to engage or to have a response? And so do we understand that stakeholder? Looking to see what brand or reputation impact might be, and that's if we do or don't engage, understanding the risks on both sides. And then also what the timing is. How fast do we have to move? Do we have some time to see if, for instance, our cohort of competitors in the airline industry, are we all thinking of coming in together through our trade association to engage? So what might that look like from a timing perspective? And then we can also bring in other subject matter experts. So marketing is not necessarily a standing member, but if there's something that we've done in our advertising, as an example, that the committee now needs to make a recommendation that we go back and tweak, we can obviously bring our different SMEs in as we need to. So we have been able to practice this with several issues, including the Texas bathroom bill. So we went through this process, and what this triangle won't do for you on the slide, but how we use it, is it's actually an interactive PDF. So as we're having the conversation, we can go through and answer some of these impact questions, and the colors on the triangle will change. And then at the outcome of the conversation, you might see a red triangle, which would tell us that there's a high risk to getting involved. We don't think it brings the right kind of impact to our various stakeholders, and therefore our recommendation might be that we don't engage. Or it might be gray, and it has been on a couple, and we have to make the decision about whether we recommend that we do or don't get engaged. It might turn green, which is a strong recommendation that we do engage, and then we obviously have options for what that engagement could look like. We like to say it's either a mild, medium, or caliente approach, depending on, because advocacy and involvement can run along a spectrum, and then we'll be able to make recommendations on what that level of engagement could look like. We used it for the Texas bathroom bill, as I mentioned, and that was a decision to engage as a Texas-based company, as one with an inclusive work environment. We had our own employees asking us to come out against the bathroom bill. We had customers on both sides of the issue. We had actually elected officials on both sides of the issue and opted to follow the ask of the Speaker of the House, Joe Strauss, at the time, who was trying to prevent the bill from coming to the House floor. So we've also been able to use it with DACA, and we did make a decision where our CEO signed on to a letter to Congress in January. We have since also signed on to an amicus brief related to DACA that came from a request of a law firm. And then we also used it to discuss, in the social context, a lot of individuals were asking airlines to engage on the border issue. When families were being separated, airlines were being asked to provide free air travel to try and reunite families. So we first came out and said that we did not condone our airline being used as a means to separate families, but said that we wanted to, help where we could be able to prevent that from happening, and, where we could also help with processes to be able to reunite families and get them back together. So again, it's a study. We've been looking at other companies. ExxonMobil in particular has been on a very similar journey as us, looking at some of the very same sort of audience impacts. They've got kind of a neat tool. I mentioned that when we get a call, we'll activate on a phone call to be able to talk through our framework. They actually have kind of an online Instapoll where they can put all their committee members online to actually take and answer challenge questions, which then helps guide them in what recommendation they would make to their C-suite. So that's something that we're taking a look at. But in a nutshell, I think it's been helpful for us to get our leadership in alignment that there is always going to be a need to consider engagement. We now have a framework to have those conversations and a real openness to look at the committee's recommendations one way or the other.
Great, and if you could also talk about the higher purpose and how that is your North Star in terms of determining the messaging, Linda?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, the purpose of Southwest Airlines is to connect people to what's important in their lives through friendly, reliable, and low-cost air travel. So we are obviously, first, we need to be reliable, safe, and dependable, but that we know that what we are doing is connecting people to what's important in their lives. Our vision is to become the most loved, most flown, and most profitable airline, and our mission is that dedication to the highest quality of customer service, delivered with a sense of warmth, friendliness, individual pride, and company spirit. So the framework I just described to you very much drives how we take a look at these various social issues. And when I mention speed, courage, and consistency, again, we'll decide on some issues that we don't need to engage. So, for instance, gun control. We did not feel a need to engage at a high level there, and after the Marjorie Stoneman high school shootings, there's obviously been a number of similar tragedies across the country. That is not an issue where to date Southwest has felt like it had to have a very strong corporate statement. We have provided air travel to some organizations that were going to either protest or gather in order to rally support for stricter gun control measures. But, not everything is going to result in a decision for Southwest Airlines to engage, but the framework does help us have the conversation, and that's what was missing when the company made the initial decision around DOMA back in the day.
Thank you. That's great. And just to add on to that, there was an Axios survey released maybe a week ago that said certain issues like civil rights and racial equality are considered the safest for brands to discuss. Others, like abortion or kneeling during the national anthem, are more risky. So again, as Linda said, you really, whether you're an agency counselor or the CCO herself, you really need to figure out what are the issues that you want to take the stand on, what are the risk implications of doing so, and then, again, the higher purpose, the corporate purpose, which leads to my next slides, that really should be your guiding light in terms of what you do or do not comment on. So to that point, I'm pleased to say Roger Bolton of the Page Society is a good friend, and he loaned me these next 3 slides. The Page Society did an in-depth analysis of corporate character and how critical it is in today's world of societal crises. And I'll explain the circle on the right in another slide or two, but it's all about defining your corporate character, activating it, and then aligning it with all of your constituent audiences internally and externally. So corporate character, obviously everyone on the phone understands this, but it's all about your mission, your purpose, your values, your culture, your business model, your strategy, and your brand itself. So it's really the DNA of your organization, who you are, what you stand for, and why each and every one of your employees shows up to work every day. So in terms of the authentic advocacy circle here, and this applies, as I said, both internally and externally, but you start with the belief. You engage the decision maker, whether the decision maker is an employee or a key customer, by forging a shared belief. More and more organizations want to partner, whether it's with agencies or supply chain partners, that share their values. So being in alignment from a value standpoint is becoming more and more of table stakes, game changer, critical. And then once you do have that higher purpose, corporate character in place, activating it. So you activate it by your actions, by your communications, and doing so spurs the decision maker, whether that's an employee who's deciding whether to stay at Southwest or go somewhere else, to act on that belief. Southwest, their purpose, their values, totally in alignment with me. I'm spending the rest of my career here. Confidence. It increases the internal or external confidence that whatever they do matters. So every employee, and this was another survey, vast majority of employees are also asking their corporations for permission to speak out on issues of the day on their own personal channels, and that gets into corporate policy, et cetera, but that's another tidal wave in terms of employee activism. So those corporations who are confident in the values and allowing their employees to espouse those values on their personal channels seem to do better in terms of retention, in terms of performance, stock, et cetera. And then building the constituency with more audiences through the networks of their advocates. So it's the networking model. If people buy in, and again, that's internal, that's externally, et cetera, to what you stand for, who you are, and what sets you apart, they want to do business with you. They want to work with you. They want to be proud of the CEO who is speaking up and speaking out. And I want to, as an agency, I want to represent those types of organizations. And as is becoming abundantly clear, more and more people on Linda's side of the equation want their agency partners to have values that are in alignment with theirs. So this is not a fad. This is the here and now, and this is the future. So,
Steve, before you leave that slide, I just wanted to underscore, please. So Southwest is a member of the Reputation Institute, so we have a monthly tracker that kind of takes a look at our reputation score, if you will, on several different dimensions, and a lot of the same dimensions that both the general public and the informed public audiences that they pull some of the same question sets out that are in this model, in this Page model, which is, you know, what is the quality of management, right, to authentically engage? Does the company, can the company articulate what it stands for? Do their actions match what they say they stand for? And so some of those same sort of test questions are in the Reputation Institute model and come out and, you know, give us sort of a monthly score, and we can see that there's some of the very same corollaries as in this model.
Great, thank you. And coming down the home stretch, and we certainly want to leave time for questions, but another sidebar that we devised, we being IPR, Tina, myself, Linda, others, we were able to identify different types of CCOs and CMOs based upon the responses that they gave us. And there was the risk-averse executive, who I mentioned earlier, who simply said he or she avoids speaking out on any controversial social topic that might alienate even a small percentage of stakeholders. So I think the risk-averse executive is putting his or her job at risk because it's just a matter of time before his or her CEO makes the same phone call that Linda's CEO made to her saying, why haven't we made a stand? Why haven't we spoken out on this? So a wake-up call for those CCOs or CMOs, and if you represent those individuals, you might want to ask how prepared they are on issues of the day. Next was the conservative communicator. Shies away from controversial and or political topics publicly, considers speaking out on hot-button issues with employees. And a real-time example of that, past couple of days, Trump, for the second or third time, went after Harley-Davidson. And he tweeted, many Harley-Davidson owners plan to boycott the company if manufacturing moves overseas. Great, exclamation point. Most other companies are coming in our direction, including Harley competitors. A really bad move. U.S. will soon have a level playing field or better. Now, the CEO of Harley followed the conservative communicator role, sent an internal memo to employees and dealers saying it's not our intention or our desire to be in the political spotlight, and the entirety of our effort and focus is to minimize any impact on this great brand, company, the business of our dealers, and critically, the passion and loyalty of our writers who we do everything for. Terrific, and I'm not commenting one way or the other if that's what they chose to do. That's a very conservative response, and it might be the right response for Harley. I'll leave that up to you to decide, but that's real time. Next is the pragmatic student, really seeks guidance, and the next 2 or 3 slides really are Linda Rutherford personified, but seeks guidance from their peers and based on best practices, as Linda talked about, creates their own tailored approach. You saw the pyramid. So the pragmatic student. The C-suite collaborator, again, Linda talked about how she actively engages with the C-suite, key employee groups, creates alignment strategy, and just an amazing action plan. Getting there, and I am so challenged with, yeah, I should get an F on the slides. Next is the, yeah, we did that one, okay. The moralist. Sees themselves as the keeper of the organization's purpose, values, and principles, willing to take a stand on issues that strike at the heart of the business. So that's the individual where there are only 2 or 3 issues that he or she thinks their company should speak out on, and regardless of what else is happening in the world, they're just going to stay locked down. Another best practice that came out that's not in the slides, and then we can go to the final couple of slides. 5 or 6 CCOs told me that their best practice, whether it was a Trump tweet, false news, et cetera, was to go to a trusted trade reporter, beat reporter, who knew the company really well, and they told their story factually and had it published, whether it was in the Detroit Free Press or Pharmaceutical News, whatever, and immediately obviously shared that on all their channels, used that as their response and their active response to false news or an attack. And I thought that was really fascinating, not even going social, but going to a trusted reporter, producer, et cetera. So I thought I would share that as well. Again, Axios. It's never been harder to manage the corporate reputation of a big company, but brands that stick to long-standing corporate values and avoid the day-to-day political fray should have a better chance at earning customer loyalty. So good luck with that. But again, it's doubling down on the corporate purpose, figuring out what you have to speak out on, and staying out of the fray if you can. Not an easy dance by any means. What you can't really see here is supposed to be a build, but the days of the ostrich sticking its head in the sand, they're gone. And those 4 or 5 CCOs, CMOs that I spoke to earlier who just don't think they need to worry about speaking out are going to get that call, whether it's from the board of directors, CEO, et cetera, saying, why didn't we speak out? So that's our wrap up. We've got another 10 minutes or so for questions.